Recently, I've been playing a lot of Dark Souls and just absolutely loving it. The amount of challenge that is present in the game, in addition to the inherent sense of satisfaction received from overcoming these challenges, really blends together to form a cohesive and satisfying experience. Making it past a particular boss or defeating a particularly challenging group of enemies has given me one of the most rewarding feelings I've gotten from any video game. Some games, such as Super Meat Boy or Hotline Miami, also manage to recreate a similar feeling through most of their game. However, a game simply being hard doesn't seem to be enough to produce this rewarding feeling on its own. Some games, such as I Want to Be the Guy or even Halo 2 on Legendary difficulty, are unable to recreate the same amount of satisfaction, and instead only just create heaps of frustration. So, this leads to a rather obvious question: what makes a hard game enjoyable? In order to do this, we need to look at what specific emotions are conjured when someone plays a game such as Dark Souls. At no point during my playthrough have I actually experienced anything close to what SpongeBob would call fun. Instead, most of my time is spent playing the game in a somewhat calm and patient state, yet while still being slightly on edge. And I feel this specifically because of the slow-paced nature of the gameplay. Both you and your foes have very slow, yet deliberate attack animations, with long wind-up times but deal large amounts of damage. Because of this, the player is required to play very conservatively, only attacking after a successful block or dodge, and a mistimed attack could lead to a quick death. Other enjoyable, hard games create a very different set of emotional responses. Hotline Miami, for instance, is a much faster-paced game than any of the games in the Souls series. Yet, every movement made in Hotline Miami is a quick, twitch-based movement, and once you've started combat, there's not time to stop and think. It's all over a matter of seconds thanks to the one-hit kill mentality. On the other side of the coin, we've got these less enjoyable games, and they have a much different quality to them. I Want to Be the Guy, for instance, focuses on ultra-hard platforming. However, the overwhelming feeling generated by the game is just frustration. The platforming feels quite inaccurate, at least compared to games such as Super Meat Boy, which leads to some of the deaths feeling quite unfair, in a game that's entire design philosophy is just unfairness. However, the majority of the difficulty present is not based on a traditional fair sense of difficulty. The game punishes the player for committing actions that there was no chance of them knowing about unless they'd seen the game before. This creates a sense that the player has been cheated, despite whether or not that's actually the case. This idea of being hard for hard's sake appears to be the central pillar of what I Want to Be the Guy stands upon. And I feel that's to its detriment. The immediate and deliberate misleading first screen of the game kills the player for taking the most logical course of action, which causes an immediate amount of frustration in the player. Once the player realizes the true path, they don't feel any amount of satisfaction they would get from completing something in Super Meat Boy. Instead, they just feel downright deceived. Let's take another look at a game that focuses on creating an extremely difficult experience over anything else. Halo 2, specifically on the Legendary difficulty. Compared to other Bungie-era Halo games, Halo 2 on Legendary is just a slog to get through. Enemies kill you in a few hits and you do far less damage than them. It completely changes the gameplay from a fast-paced run-and-gun affair to a Call of Duty-esque stop-and-pop shooter. While this might not be inherently bad, the problem lies in the fact that these levels are not designed for this sort of gameplay, which can make you feel as if you're just cheating the system rather than overcoming obstacles. For instance, when you approach this area in the first level, Cairo Station, the layout suggests the player should charge forward and take out the enemies before they can mount an effective defense, all while using these alcoves for various different pieces of cover. However, on Legendary, this tactic is completely unviable, and it requires the player to cower behind various pieces of cover at the back of the room, only exposing themselves to fire off a few shots then return to cover. In addition, the recharging energy shields present on the elites requires the player to only use a select combination of weapons to handle them effectively, largely reducing how the player can interact with the weapon sandbox. During my playthrough of Halo 2 on Legendary, I found myself relying on an overcharged plasma pistol and a headshot weapon 90% of the time, which severely limited my enjoyment of the experience. In addition, Halo 2's biggest issue with its difficulty is the extremely large number of one-hit kill snipers it places in its levels. These enemies can kill a player without any warning, and it just leads to frustration very reminiscent of I Want to Be the Guy. Other games in the Halo series managed to counter this problem pretty effectively by limiting the number of enemies that can kill the player without warning, as well as balancing both the environments and the weapons arsenal to encourage a variety of playstyles. While a particular strategy that worked on easy might not be viable on Legendary, all of the weapons in Halo Combat Evolved are just as viable as one another. The way Halo CE handles health also contributes to its very satisfying nature, as player shields can withstand a relatively large beating, allowing for some run-and-gun tactics to remain viable even on the hardest of situations. The non-regenerating health also adds a pretty good feeling of the fact that the mistakes you made in combat have permanent consequences, so pulling off a successful battle makes it feel even more rewarding than ever. Because of how these elements combine, the player can tackle any encounter any way they see fit, which provides not only a challenge, but also never appears like the game is trying to cheat you, which creates a rewarding feeling present in games such as Dark Souls. By looking at what these various games have done right and contrasting it with what the other ones have done wrong, I've managed to put together a somewhat loose guide to see what exactly makes these hard games enjoyable and not frustrating. They are as follows. 1. The game rules must remain constant. This means that a game should not suddenly change how the rules operate. A healing item shouldn't suddenly deal damage to the player, and a platform shouldn't kill the player when all others of the same type are safe. This is an issue in games such as I Wanna Be the Guy and Cat Mario, and they've got it in spades. Game rules changing for no good reason only leads to frustration on the player's behalf. 2. Threats must be predictable and avoidable. If something's going to hurt the player, it should be telegraphed in some sort of fashion that will allow the chance for the player to avoid them. These blades in Super Meat Boy, while extremely fast moving, are viewable by the player before they come into effect, which allows the player to react accordingly. The same thing happens in Dark Souls. All of the enemies take time to telegraph their attacks, allowing the player to block or dodge them before they even get hit. This allows the player to feel as if they are improving as they play the game, and are always somewhat in control of the situation. These apples in I Wanna Be the Guy, on the other hand, do not give any indication that they will hurt the player until they just do. Again, this only causes frustration. 3. A failure state should not impose a large setback. When a player does achieve the failure state of a game, they shouldn't be punished too badly and should be able to get back into the game pretty quickly. Both Hotline Miami and Super Meat Boy have relatively short levels with instantaneous respawn timers, which cause the player to get straight back into the action without having time to be upset about their death. Even games such as Dark Souls have relatively lax penalties for failure, with bonfire placement being done in such a way that no distance is too far away from any death location, meaning the player can get back to where they died at a reasonable rate. Even the souls that are lost on death give the player a chance to reclaim them if they are skillful enough. 4. Player choice and variety is required. All hard games need to have an element of player choice for them to be fun. Unlike I said earlier, playing Halo 2 on Legendary is inherently unfun, due to the game forcing a particular playstyle onto the player to be efficient. This playstyle doesn't even need to change throughout the entirety of the game. Games that allow for player choice or provide an amount of variety allow for the challenge to remain for the entire game, while still providing something fresh to break up the monotony. Imagine if the enemies present in Dark Souls' Undead Asylum were the only ones in the entire game, or if Super Meat Boy only had the various traps present in World 1. The game would become stale and boring really quickly, despite how hard it was. In addition, the player also adds an element of satisfaction, as the player knows that they have the option to pick another path or playstyle, but this particular one worked for them. The feeling that you managed to kill a group of enemies pretty easily is because you picked your particular build, which gives you a large sense of satisfaction, not only because you overcame the challenge, but you managed to do it your way. Well, there you have it, my completely subjective list of what makes a hard game enjoyable and not frustrating. If any of these criteria are even missing from a game, it's likely that the game will become somewhat frustrating. Even some of the games that I use as examples of how to do a hard game right fall victim to this. For instance, the boss of Hell in Super Meat Boy provides a threat that has not telegraphed its attacks pretty well, meaning the only way to beat the boss is through pure attrition, which leads to an ultimately boring experience. It might be easier for the developers to create a hard game, and that's why Flappy Bird exists. And these games become popular because they tap into the ingrained human desire to overcome an obstacle. But for a hard game to become truly fulfilling, to encourage the player to keep coming back again and again, all while providing a sense of accomplishment, is no mean feat. It requires a sense of balance, high skill, and an understanding of what needs to be done. The exact skills that are required for someone to play these games.